Hey students, this is your Professor O'Million Chuck, and today I want to finish up the second part of our two-part series on week 4, health and disease concepts. And today I want to go over just value neutrality and the issue of medicalization. Right? We want to talk a little bit about that. All right, so I want to go over some things that we might find desirable in our definition of disease, how we want to think about it, and then kind of get into what it means to have normal functioning and see if we can come up with a value neutral account of disease, and then examine a criticism of that, and then finish up with what the problem of medicalization is. All right, before we do that though, I want you to warm up a little bit and just think about this. Why do you think that psychiatric conditions often become ways in which we identify ourselves? Right, so I don't know if you've heard people talk this way. This is kind of what I'm on about. Sometimes you'll hear people tell you that they are bipolar. Right? I am bipolar. Instead of saying I have bipolar disorder or I am ADHD versus I have ADHD, it's kind of an interesting way of talking. Right? I am autistic, rather than I have autism. Okay, it's an interesting way that we speak. Right? Certainly, we don't think about this. We don't identify ourselves with that like a sexually transmitted disease. I'm a syphilic or something like that. That would be a really weird way to talk. Or I am AIDS. Now, of course, no one would say anything like that, but it is kind of strange. Like I am bipolar. Anyway, I just want you to think about that and answer that question. Right? I think it's interesting. Why do we do this? Okay. All right, so let's talk about some, I call these things Desiderata. I don't know if you've ever heard of the word Desiderata. Those are just desirable attributes that we might have in our disease concepts, right? And I pull this from the paper that I wrote. This is in the Designing Disease section. This little paper by Walker and Rogers, which I think is actually really interesting. They want to give a kind of cluster analysis or cluster conditions for disease membership, right? So in the membership of the class of diseases, you gotta at least have like 2 of these, right? And if you have any 3 of them, you're a disease, but not any one of them is individually necessary. It's kind of an interesting argument. I'm not gonna rehearse it for you now, but just to kind of go back to it, right? It is kind of interesting if you think about it, right? So if you have 2 of these that a physical condition or mental condition is satisfying, that makes it at least eligible for disease consideration. Now you might need more to qualify, so I think if you have 3 of these together, you probably have a disease, right? But if you just have 2 and 3, that can give you some odd results. So it's harmful, right? And it's explainable in terms of biology. Well, or it causes suffering or incapacitation. That could make pregnancy a disease, right? Pregnancy is uncomfortable. It does cause some suffering. It does cause some incapacitation, right? My wife has been pregnant twice now in our marriage, and there's definitely that's the case. It's certainly explainable in terms of the principles of facts of biology, right? But it's not a disease, okay? Being pregnant is actually is an interesting sign of health. This is a function, at least, that is ordered towards the survival and reproduction of the species, right? Notwithstanding unusual complications, this is something that the female body, right, is kind of set up to do, right? And it's certainly in our case, in my wife's case, everything worked out fine. We had 2 little babies, beautiful little children, and so we wouldn't want to classify that state as a disease. We might pay attention to it as maybe causing other health issues that we want to be mindful of, but the state of pregnancy itself, that's not a disease, right? And so we really want to be careful with these, okay? We really want to be careful with these. And the one that I think that requires the most care that I'm going to focus on, at least for the purposes of this unit and this lecture, is the issue of dysfunction. Because as we saw in the last lecture, dysfunction was something that was easy to make sense of when you had Aristotle's ideas of formal and final causation. I got a little link here. If you were really kind of curious about what those meant, you can follow this link and it'll take you to this handy little page. This is Aristotle's 4 causes here. This is on a page called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's really nice. You can type in stuff about disease concepts, I think. They should have some stuff. And you can get into the definition of death here. There's all kinds of interesting things up on this webpage you might check out. But they will explain, Aristotle's 4 causes for you. And there's a real pro who does this. So I just have you, I point that in your direction. So if you want some extra background reading, you can check that out, right? But, we saw, right, that there, in Aristotle's view, there was this idea of a human life form, right? A form that specifies what it is to be human. And in virtue of having that form, you are directed towards a certain end, right? And so he calls these formal and final causes. Now, in the modern era, modern science has largely done away with these ideas. So in Newtonian physics, Einsteinian physics, there's no room for this kind of stuff. Darwinian evolution, some people try to make sense of these ideas in light of those facts, but they have largely been eliminated. So how then do you think of normal functioning? Okay. Well, there's an answer that's been proposed. You can think of it this way: by defining health as merely the absence of disease in a way that's value neutral. And to do this, you have to conceive of normal functioning or normalcy in statistical terms. Okay, so now we're going to look to the area of stats. What's likely to be the case? What's the case most of the time? All right, and then apply that those terms to some identifiable group of individuals that we can enumerate and count. All right, so this is very much in line with kind of a modern scientific worldview, right? We want a class of things that we can enumerate and count, things that we can observe about them, and what we'll do is that we'll just kind of report those and give ourselves a kind of a nice, picture that we can paint with broad brushes here, and make claims of normativity and normal functioning and normalcy purely in terms of the statistical variances and invariances that we observe. Okay, so it's kind of okay. So this seems to kind of get at what it would be a value neutral concept of disease, right? And then health is just going to be the absence of that. Okay, so health does not involve something like flourishing. We don't go beyond the absence of disease like we did with Aristotle. Right? We just say, well, you know what? You just don't have these problems. Okay, and so there you go. This, of course, is the answer proposed by Christopher Boorse. This was your reading, right? This big long paper. You only had to read from 13, though. Starting on page 13, I think you had, the first 2 pages were assigned. Yeah, what did I do? First 2 pages, and then 13 through 22. Boorse is known for his very long papers. And but he is fairly comprehensive in his views, and so he does try to give an example of this, right, where we have a value-free theoretical notion. Okay, this is what he's up to. This is his life project, and he's been defending this ever since 1977. Okay, so I say this in the paper I wrote, but for Boorse, and this is kind of very rough. It's a summary, right? A disease is a type of internal state. All right, so that whole external nonsense about your social setting and circumstances, that's not a part of health. That's not a part of disease. A disease is an internal state that's going to impair some sense of normal functioning. Right? It's going to impair the normal functioning of a member of a reference class of organisms. Okay, so disease is going to apply to organisms, right? Any other use of that is going to be metaphorical. Okay, so a diseased ecosystem, right? That's just a metaphorical use. What we need is something that rather attaches to a member of the reference class of the organisms, and then determines that its normal functioning is being impaired. Now, what's characteristic of these organisms is that they have a uniform functional design. Now, the design doesn't have to be made by some designer or creator. It could just be outfitted by the evolutionary process, right? So it's a functional design where normal functioning is statistically ordered towards the end of survival and reproduction. All right, so the normal functioning here, look, functions always have some goal in mind. So we still have an attenuated form of final causation here. It's just not specified by some kind of metaphysical form, right? What's that? Is that a soul? Okay, no, we don't appeal to anything like that. Rather, what we do is we see whether or not these things are contributing towards the end of the survival of the organism, so keeping it going, adapting it to its environment, being free from predation or inclement weather, these kinds of things, and then also reproducing members of its kind. Okay, all right, so that is very much in line with kind of a modern scientific view of the world. Remember, I think what's going on here is that Boorse's goal, and I think he says this explicitly, right? He wants to replace the old idea that the normal is the natural, right? So that's going to be Aristotle's idea, right? The natural human being, insofar as it's exemplifying human nature and all of its capacities are being activated without being, subject to injury or defect or anything like that, is going to then be a normal human being. Okay, so there is an ideal. There's an ideal of form of the human being on Aristotle's view, and that's what we are naturally. Okay, deviations from what's natural ends up being abnormal. Okay, and in Boorse, he wants to replace that with the idea that the normal is the statistical. What's actually happening? What's actually the case? And what do we observe in nature? And what is really going on? What is the broad, general pattern? Okay, and that's what he's interested in. So I don't think it's literally mathematical. I suppose you could sit down and design some kind of study, right? But I think there's something just more intuitive than this. Like, what do we just normally see? We don't see any white ravens. We see black ones. So the next raven we see will probably be black. Okay, so it's that kind of idea, right? He's also wanting to redescribe Aristotle's idea of the end goal of creaturely flourishing. So, Aristotle has this really robust view, especially of human flourishing. What does it mean to be a human, and what does it mean to flourish? And a lot of that has to do with exemplifying certain virtues, and the virtues have to do with things like being courageous, being magnanimous, right? Being, wise. Okay, and so these are things that are just kind of far outside of the purview of science, right? It's not just about being healthy, right? And it's also about kind of, enhancing this character, right? Boorse wants to replace that with just the Darwinian observations that creatures in the biological world really are ordered to furthering their survival and their reproduction. Okay, so we replace kind of the Aristotelian goals, or we supplement, we reconceive of or reimagine what it means to flourish in Darwinian terms. Okay, so maybe cockroaches are they're the ones that flourish most on planet Earth, right? Because they survive and reproduce like none other. Okay, whereas we humans, well, all of our worries about overpopulation, we have the capacity to completely wreck ourselves, and I don't know how long we're going to be around. That's really kind of a question I was actually thinking about that today, and just when's that day gonna come when Earth no longer puts up with us, right? It'll probably put up with cockroaches at any rate. So that's the idea. Here's a little bit more exposition of Boorse from his paper. He just wants just to kind of clarify some of these ideas. Right? What is he talking about when he's talking about a reference class? Well, he's talking about a natural class of organisms that have a uniform functional design. And these can be specified by age or their sex, or whatever other feature we're interested in as species membership goes. Normal function, right? It's going to be part of a process within the members of the class that statistically contributes to their survival and reproduction. Health, then, right, is the readiness of each internal part of the organism to perform all of its normal functions on typical occasions with at least typical efficacy or efficiency. And then a disease is a type of internal state which impairs the health, okay? Reduces the functional abilities below typical efficiency. And these things can be categorized in statistical terms. What do you mean by typical efficiency? Well, we can do some stats and figure it out, okay? All right, so advantages to this, right? Look, what it does is it frames disease in a way that produces a fruitful research program. Okay, so what it does is it allows scientists to make generalizable claims without committing to controversial value systems. And that's actually pretty handy, especially when you're trying to get funding to study things. Right? You're going to talk about a certain kind of cancer and how it grows, and you want to get funding to research it. Well, you can kind of talk about what exactly this phenomenon is, right? How it reduces the typical efficiency of the human organism or a human organ, and then you can get your funding and go on and do your work, right? So people like this idea, okay? You don't have to get into ideas about social control and what's good for society. I mean, obviously curing diseases is good for society. We've already assumed that. Nobody disagrees with that. And so just having this way of pushing your research can be really, really helpful, okay? Really, really helpful. It's not like you're asking for money to investigate into the intelligence of other races. Okay, that's going to be a little more controversial, and the government's going to be like, I don't know if we need to prioritize that because that seems to not be in line, or at least the implications of your research is not in line with the kind of values we have as a society, right? But if you can kind of frame things along the way Boorse thinks, well then, right, it might be a little bit easier, okay, to kind of be neutral in disputes about things and go on and do your research, all right? At least this is one of the things that's often cited in favor of Boorse, and I mentioned this in the paper that I wrote about it. But there are objections, okay? There are some objections to his theory, and he's really, most of the papers that he's written since are basically defenses of his idea from Objections. He gets a lot of flack, all right? And so let's just kind of go over a couple of them that feature prominently. One of the most famous, this actually comes from the other author we had to read, is Engelhardt. He thinks that values injected into the theory by naming survival and reproduction as the goals of normal functioning. And he just thinks, well, why assume that it's good to survive and reproduce? I mean, let's think about our cockroaches again. I mean, what's so great about them surviving and reproducing? Now, maybe they contribute to an ecosystem in some way, right? But, so, all right, let's put them on the shelf. Let's talk about mosquitoes that cause malaria. Are they some important part of the ecosystem? And if they are, how important is it, right? Do they, it seems like you could just eradicate them and, the world would be a better place, okay? And so why worry about this? Why think that even human survival and reproduction is a good thing? Don't we harm a lot of animals and the planet and all these kinds of things? So you can kind of see where this discussion is going to go, right? I think Boorse can reply to this, all right? I think will say something like this, well, it's not assumed, right? It's just inferred from observation, right? Now, Darwin did this, and any evolutionary biologist will just kind of tell you this is just how organisms work. And so we're not assuming that it is valuable, all right? But this is just what the functions are aimed at, and things that impair these functions are going to tell us something about the physical state and the health of the organism. It's not able to perform this function, right? So that's the problem there, right? And that's the way of replying, okay? A more difficult objection, I think, is objection 2. What's the criteria for membership in a reference class? that can be really, really value laden. Okay. Now, I don't know if you've been following current events at all, if you've been living under a rock. Who counts as a member of a certain sex, it actually turns out to be quite a fraught question. So, are trans women women? Okay, that is a really, really big question. That's actually being debated quite vigorously in the UK today. If you put in kind of trans issues in the UK into Google, you're going to get all kinds of stuff that comes up. All right, and so if trans women are women, do women menstruate? If women menstruate, are trans women women? Okay, these are questions, all right, that really, really involve some deep value commitments here, and they really matter. Another thing that's been in the news lately, if you've been paying attention, is about the runner from South Africa, Caster Semenya. I think that's how you say the name. So I apologize if I botched that. But should she be allowed to compete in women's track and field, right? There's a reference class here that matters for women's sports, okay? And there's a developmental disorder, a gender developmental disorder, I believe, that gets cited in this type of discussion, where it's how do you classify someone like this as a woman? Okay, there's interesting questions here that have to be resolved, and they have major implications, right, for these activities like sport. All right, and so how do you reply to that, Boorse? And I don't know how he does reply to that, honestly. I think that's actually something I'm not even going to try to imagine how this works out. All right, it's beyond sort of my competence to answer this. I'll leave you to think about that, right? But that can be a really, really value-laden issue, all right? And so I just bring that up to kind of just show, how this issue is far from obviously determined just by mere observation. Okay, and then you might also just think his theory just gets the wrong results. For example, on his theory, it pathologizes homosexuality as a disease. It just does. Okay, this is just I don't know why spell check is doing that. There you go, right? There's a sad history about this, right? I don't know if you've seen the movie The Imitation Game. Right, it's a very interesting and sad movie about a British mathematician who contributed hugely to the war effort, and then who was subsequently, I believe, castrated for committing the crime of some kind of sodomy law, whatever. And it's just, it's just this. Oh my gosh, it's just so awful, right? And so there is really, we really might think this theory is in trouble, because if it's going to pathologize something like this, because this does, right, homosexuality does impair the functioning of biological reproduction, right? It's just, it's just kind of the way it goes, right? And so on Boorse's disease model, it becomes a disease, all right? And so we might think that this is just not how we want to think about this. Boorse has wrestled with this objection mightily, and he says something like this, is that it's going to get the wrong results only if we assume that the diseases must be controlled, right? But a value-neutral theory of disease doesn't have to make that assumption. Some diseases can be tolerated or even conceived as benign. And I think even Boorse might even admit that this is just a defect of his theory. It's just, no theory is perfect, but, it's good enough. It produces scientific research program results. It's very useful in, biomedicine and so on and so forth, right? And so this is just something, this is kind of an anomaly. We're like, well, it produces results. We don't really like this. And look, Boorse is all about giving people their rights and not controlling people, right, who are LGBT or anything like that. Okay, so I need to say that clearly. But his theory does produce this result, so you might just think, well, that's not a good theory because of that result. Right. So what do you think of Boorse's theory? Right? Do you think any of these objections are fatal? Are there adequate ways of responding to them? Do you think that do you even just think, well, you know what, it's not perfect, but it's good enough, right? It's good enough for medical work, right? You might think that we can just get on with the work of medicine with this, right? So think about that. Right, some people who think that Boorse is all washed up think that there is no value-neutral disease concept at all. And the case against the value-neutral concept proceeds pretty simply, right? What you do is you just identify a condition or activity that's reported to be a disease in the history of medicine, but that just clearly isn't one, or is no longer accepted as such, right? So it's look, if diseases are just these kind of biological things, you would think that their definitions would be relatively stable over time, because human nature is relatively stable over time, and anything that affects human health, which affects human nature, like a disease, it's going to show up, across time and across cultures. Well, it turns out that's not the case, right? And so then you go on to identify the social or moral reasons as to why the condition was thought to be a disease, why it was thought to be something to be controlled, cured, or managed, right? Then the case proceeds to show that those who claim that the condition or activity was a disease were really taking themselves to be scientific and value neutral, even though in reality they weren't. So if you read the paper by Engelhardt on the disease of masturbation, which I just kind of find hilarious, is that it fits all three criteria, right? We no longer accept that masturbation is a disease or a health problem. I mean, nobody thinks this, okay? Even people who have moral problems with masturbation don't think this, okay? Masturbation still is and was, right, associated with sometimes criminal, sexual deviancy and undesirable feelings of guilt, right? And that could be over just, the abnormality. There's like a feeling of abnormality. This is not how I should be using my body. Okay, maybe that's associated with attitudes of lust that are just inappropriate or gross, or, this is just not how, we should be thinking, right? That kind of stuff. There's issues about inadequacy. Okay, it's just this isn't real sex. It's this is something that pathetic people do, lonely people do, something like that. And then there's just issues of anxiety, right? It's a kind of nervousness. It's something that it's associated with these negative things. Okay, things that we want to be rid of. Right. And then if you read the details, and most of his paper is just about the various absurd and very different theories and diagnosis and treatments that were made available by health professionals to deal with the disease of masturbation at the time. You just see this, and it's all there, right? And the key point that Engelhardt wants to make at the end of his paper is this: that the best explanation for these three things that we observe in the history of medicine is not because there was some deficiency in how people were deploying the scientific method. They were doing science just as well as anybody else, right? But it was because their scientific reasoning depended upon prior evaluations of reality, right? So I don't know. Do you agree with that? Or do you think Engelhardt's all washed up? Do you just think these people are just doing bad science? Right? Do you think they are just doing bad science? Because what Engelhardt really thinks is that he thinks that virtue and vice, while they're not the same as health and disease, they bear a direct relation on the concepts. Okay, and so even if you're doing science, this is going to be a part of your scientific reasoning, whether you like it or not. Okay, so think about that, right? Think about that, because and if it's the case that these do bear a direct relation, then you just can't ever have a value neutral concept of disease. Okay? All right, last thing I want to talk about quickly here, I know I'm running out of time, is the medical gaze, all right, and the process of medicalization. So the medical gaze is this phrase that comes from Michel Foucault. He was this French postmodern social critic sometimes philosopher, sometimes sociologist, sometimes English professor. He's kind of all over the place, and he wrote a lot of different things. Some of it's really interesting. Some of it makes no sense, but this actually does make some sense. He wrote this book called The Birth of the Clinic, and he talked about the medical gaze as a kind of framework in which the clinician or physician or doctor evaluates the bodies under examination, right? And medically separates them from the personhood or identity of the patient, and exercises an insidious power relation over them. Right? You become kind of a science experiment. You start treating the disease and not the person, right? And it's fundamentally dehumanizing. Foucault thinks this is characteristic of modern medicine and its technological process and the kind of, the molecular biology and biochemical analysis that all happens in medicine. If you read the New England Journal of Medicine, right, it is not a humanistic thing. It's very, very much a scientific thing. And so what's lost in this is the identity of the patient, right? And so he thinks this is characteristic of the medical gaze. Now you have to understand he wrote at a time in the 1960s when homosexuality was considered to be a health problem. Okay, and so like think about Boorse's theory again, right? Homosexuality was pathologized and there were deep consequences for that. Something to be treated. And he believed that the way to resist this was to unmask the powers behind disease concepts, right, and achieve liberation. So the idea here is to kind of do what Engelhardt was doing in his paper, right? It was to unmask, right, the kind of value judgments that were at work in the disease concept and the very idea of thinking that masturbation was a disease. Now, the thing about this is that this has survived on. Foucault's work has inspired all kinds of reflection. And one of the ways it has been applied is to the issues of direct to consumer marketing, all right? Direct to consumer marketing. And this should say, there we go. Boy, I see my typos whenever I'm doing my lecture. How do you like that? What does direct-to-consumer marketing do? What I want you to do is actually watch this interesting YouTube video about it, right? So there'll be a little card that comes up that will link to that. Just check it out. And what it ends up doing is something really interesting to us, is that it incentivizes making healthy people feel like they are unhealthy. And drug companies do have an interest in this. Historically, many of them have wanted to expand disease concepts. Back in the 1960s and 70s, I believe, I forget the decade now, drug companies marketed the chemical estrogen to women, right? Especially post-menopausal women, to make them more feminine, okay? And make them feel like women again, right? Of course, this ended up, being correlated with side effects that involve death, but right, you could see how the drug company can make money off of this. And drug companies make money off of really kind of just interesting physical conditions, like heartburn, right? It's not like a fatal or serious ailment, but it's one that's widely shared by many people, and it inhibits like eating spicy foods and burritos and stuff like that. So if you could take a drug like Prilosec, right, and have this 10-year patent, you could prescribe boatloads of these pills and make billions upon billions of dollars, right? Restless legs. I don't know if you remember the thing called restless leg syndrome. There's medication for that. Interrupted sleeping patterns, right? You need an Ambien. Okay, maintenance of an erection. We've seen all kinds of drugs for that. And then, of course, menopause, right? These are widely shared human experiences. Now, I know you all are young, right? And so maybe you don't have issues like this, but as people get to be middle-aged, they do. And so, the drug company comes along and says, hey, you have a problem, we have a fix. But are these really health problems? I mean, really? There comes a time when the female body stops ovulating, right? There comes a time when men can't maintain an erection like they used to. Things kind of wear out. Aging happens, right? Sleeping is always kind of difficult, right? there's all kinds of reasons why we have interrupted sleeping patterns. Some of them are more serious than others, right? You might have sleep apnea and that kind of thing. But you might just have I don't know, just a bad sleeping habit. Why do you need medication for it? Are there other ways of dealing with this? Okay, so are those real health problems, or can you think of others, right? And are there other ones that are more serious that we should be worrying about? Right? Maybe we need a vaccine for malaria. That affects a lot of people. It just don't happen to this doesn't happen to affect people in the U.S. that have money. Okay, so issue. Right, and then let's ask this question, what are some of the ways that we can resist the process of medicalization? Right, so you're watching these ads and they're telling you something about what it means to be healthy and what it means to be a human being. What are some ways that you might resist that? Okay, and here's the thing, if values are always going to be entangled in our disease concept, then which values should be promoted? Okay, and which ones should be guarded against? Right, let's assume that there's always going to be values involved. How should we promote the values that are matter to us and be on guard against the ones that might be harmful? Right, so that is the lecture. I know I went a little bit longer, but I did want to talk about all these things because I think they're pretty important. And so if you have any questions, let me know via email or in the discussion section, and I will talk to you later.